They only buried the bodies they couldn't keep.
That was the first sentence in a journal the world was never supposed to see. It was found beneath the floorboards of a funeral home in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The ink had faded, but the truth was seared into the pages like a curse. If you're hearing this now, it's because someone failed to burn the last copy. And once you know what I'm about to tell you, you'll never look at death or family the same way again. In the autumn of 1823, death came often, but never by chance. The Hartwells ran the only funeral parlor in town, a respected family of God-fearing citizens who wore their grief like armor and buried your loved ones with the tenderness of saints. But behind their kindness was a predator's patience, and a hunger no prayer could silence. This isn't a ghost story. This is a story about what happens when death becomes an enterprise, when the line between embalmer and executioner disappears, and the people you trust with the dead start choosing who dies next. You see, it wasn't the sudden spike in deaths that first raised suspicion. It was what wasn't there. No screams, no struggle. No one ever seemed to fight for their life. Because by the time the Hartwells came to your door, it was already too late. Millbrook was a quiet town, a place where people knew each other by name, where church bells marked the hours and everyone waved when they passed on horseback. But beneath that neighborly calm was a system built on compliance. Institutions were sacred. The church, the family, the undertaker. You didn't question them, you didn't want to. That's how evil survives. In plain sight, wearing a smile. The funeral home sat at the edge of town, its ivy-covered stones whispering secrets to the wind. Generations walked into that parlor to mourn. They left lighter, not just in heart, but in gold, in property, in bloodlines. The Hartwells didn't just clean the dead. They curated death itself. What makes this story different is not just what the family did, but how long they got away with it and why. Because once you see it, really see it, you'll understand. This wasn't just one corrupted family. It was a design, a mechanism, a proof of concept, and it worked. Now the question is, how many Hartwells walk among us today? The town never asked where the money went. Every coffin that passed through the Hartwell funeral home was a sealed deal, not just with the earth, but with silence. The dead were often wealthy, always isolated, and strangely, untouched. Coroners, when called in from out of town, noticed something peculiar. Bodies drained not only of blood but of expression. No sign of agony, no tension in the muscles, just serenity. Like they welcomed death. But death didn't visit them. It lived with them. At the center of it all was Eleanor Hartwell, matriarch, embalmer, and rumored medium. She had eyes like frostbite, cold, silent, and deadly if you stared too long. People whispered that she could predict death, that she knew when someone's time had come. What they didn't realize was that Eleanor wasn't predicting anything. She was deciding. Eleanor kept a leather-bound journal, the one they found beneath the floorboards. The first entry was dated 1792, 31 years before her official birth. Every page marked with initials, addresses, and something strange, a word beside each name. Ripened. That's what chilled investigators. These weren't random killings, they were harvests. The family believed certain souls had ripeness, a spiritual sweetness, a kind of cosmic value, and when the fruit was ready, they picked it. What that value meant, no one could fully decode. But local lore hints at something older than scripture, a belief rooted in Appalachian blood rituals mingled with early settler superstitions. A theory that if you preserved the right soul in death, you could borrow time from it. That would explain the Hartwells' longevity. Eleanor lived well into her 90s. Her husband, Silas, passed 5 times in public record, each time pronounced dead, each time buried. But days later, someone matching his description would be seen walking the halls of the funeral home at night, humming an old Welsh lullaby, and then another person would die. Millbrook called it a miracle. They called it grace. But it was a cycle, a blood tithe dressed in mourning cloth. The richer the grief, the stronger the transfer. That's why the Hartwells focused on families with no next of kin, no one to question, no one to dig, no one to miss the missing. It worked for decades, until a child survived. And that child, he remembered everything. His name was Jonah Wren, 7 years old. Frail, quiet, with a birthmark shaped like a spiral on the inside of his left wrist. No one in town remembers seeing him before the fire, but he remembers everything from that night, every scream, every shadow, and the sound of earth being shoveled before anyone had even died. It was the night his parents were buried alive. They had just moved into the outskirts of Millbrook, city people hopeful, desperate for a quiet life. His father, a history professor, his mother, a painter. Neither believed in ghosts. Neither believed in curses, until the invitations came, hand-delivered by a Hartwell. The cards were black, embossed with silver ink, a town welcome dinner hosted at the funeral home. Jonah didn't want to go. He said the walls were breathing. He said Eleanor's shadow wasn't attached to her feet. He said Silas tried to touch his skin when no one was looking, but his parents smiled politely, patted his head, and told him to behave. He remembers being led down the basement stairs for a surprise. He remembers the cold, how it wasn't like air-conditioned chill, but something wet, like fog pressed into flesh. There were caskets, empty, except for one, which had his name carved into the lining. Jonah screamed, but no one helped. His father collapsed first. No blood, no wounds, just stillness. His mother tried to fight back, grabbing an embalming tool and slicing Eleanor across the hand, but Eleanor didn't bleed. Instead, she whispered in a tongue Jonah couldn't understand. His mother's eyes went white, and then silence. They placed both parents in coffins. They nailed them shut with ritualistic care, all while Jonah watched from inside a glass cabinet, paralyzed, not by fear, but by something Eleanor called the quiet. And then a flicker of something they hadn't expected. Jonah moved, a twitch, a tear, a pulse that should have been gone. Whatever ritual they used didn't work on him. His soul didn't ripen. He wasn't ready. They panicked. Fire was their cleanup. But fate wasn't finished. Jonah survived, carried out by someone unseen, someone or something that hated the Hartwells even more than he did. For 20 years, he vanished, until he came back, with scars across his chest and a book bound in human skin. And inside that book, every ritual, every name, every soul that was never laid to rest. They say grief makes you forget, but Jonah never forgot. He knew every brick of that funeral home, every creaking stair, every door that led to a lie. And most of all, he remembered the silence that came just before someone disappeared. It was the Hartwell family's signature. But when Jonah returned, he didn't come as a lost boy. He came as the storm they buried. His face had changed, older, hollow-eyed, carved with strange symbols down the sides of his neck. Locals whispered that he never blinked, that when he walked, birds would fall from the trees, dogs wouldn't bark, wind wouldn't blow, even fire wouldn't flicker, because the thing that saved Jonah had followed him, and now it lived inside him. He entered Millbrook just before dusk. No suitcase, no car, just the book, thick, heavy, wrapped in leather that twitched like it was breathing. On the front, A stitched eye, closed. For now. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't need to. The town remembered him, or maybe it remembered what happened after he left. The disappearances, the dreams, the unmarked graves. He walked straight to the funeral home. It had been shut for years, left to rot, but the lock on the door was new, shiny, polished. Someone had been keeping it alive. He broke in without a sound. Inside, time hadn't moved. Candles still lined the walls. Dried blood still stained the floor. And in the center, an altar, cracked but intact. Jonah opened the book. He didn't read from it. Not yet. He only placed it on the altar. The stitched eye opened, slowly, and the room grew cold. Then the voices started, whispers crawling across the walls like spiders, calling his name. But this time, he wasn't afraid. He spoke a name, just one. Silas. The walls shook. A scream, buried deep beneath the house, echoed like it was scraping its way up. The dead had heard him. Because Jonah hadn't come to haunt the Hartwells. He had come to unearth what they'd been feeding on. The children, the missing, the buried. This wasn't revenge. This was resurrection. And Millbrook would choke on the bones it thought it hid. The floorboards groaned beneath Jonah's feet, as if the house itself remembered him. He took one step forward, and every candle in the room sparked to life, not with flame, but with blue fire, flickering cold and silent. Shadows danced backward, gravity bent in wrong directions. And then, footsteps from the cellar. Not rushed, not hesitant, but ritualistic, one after another like a march. Jonah didn't flinch. He looked toward the stairs, eyes steady. The book on the altar began to hum, low and guttural, like something chanting from beneath the earth. He whispered, "Show me." And the floor split open. It didn't crack, it peeled, like flesh unzipping. A long black corridor, wet and breathing, unfolded downward where the staircase used to be. Walls pulsed with veins. Jonah stepped into the dark. As he descended, the air grew thicker. The smell of rot, copper and sugar filled his nose. Not natural, not human. It was the scent of things preserved, not buried. At the bottom, a dim red light pulsed like a heartbeat, and there, at the end of the corridor, stood a door, hand-carved, heavy, covered in symbols Jonah had only seen in dreams, and etched across the top in dark iron lettering, "Those who feed must never sleep." Jonah didn't hesitate. He placed his hand on the center. It burned. Flesh sizzled, but he didn't scream, didn't wince. The door opened on its own. Inside was a chamber, silent, lined with drawers like a morgue, but each drawer breathed softly, shivering, like what lay inside was still dreaming. In the center, something hung, a body upside down, thin, with no eyes, mouth sewn shut, and the Hartwell family crest branded into its chest, still smoking. This was no sacrifice. This was a messenger. Jonah stepped forward, and as he did, the book snapped open on its own upstairs, pages turning violently, names spilling out. One name in particular, repeated over and over. Eliza Hartwell, the matriarch, the founder, the original sin. And somewhere, miles away, her eyes opened. She felt it. Jonah had returned. And he wasn't just digging up the past. He was about to kill the bloodline. Eliza Hartwell hadn't been seen in over a century. Not officially. But deep in the Blackwood archives, beneath newspaper clippings and crumbling family records, Jonah had found it. A funeral that never happened, a death certificate with no doctor's signature, and a final photo where Eliza stood at her daughter's wedding decades after she was declared dead. No one noticed her in the photo at first. She wasn't smiling, wasn't even looking at the camera. She was staring directly at the bride, one hand slightly raised, fingers curled like she was casting something. Jonah remembered the words etched into the altar, "The blood that births the curse must be returned." And now, standing in front of the eyeless body hanging in the chamber, he understood. This wasn't about uncovering secrets. It was about ending a pact. The body moved, only slightly, like a pendulum pushed by invisible breath. And then its mouth, sewn shut with black thread, began to leak blood. Not drip, not ooze. It flowed upward, curling into the air like smoke, forming symbols, sigils, warnings. Jonah backed away. But behind him the door had vanished. The corridor was gone. He wasn't in the chamber anymore. He was in a room that looked exactly like his childhood bedroom, but older, decayed, like it had been left to rot since he last left. Toys molded into the floorboards, the wallpaper moved, breathed, and on the bed, a woman, back turned, hair gray and brittle, hands folded over her chest like a corpse prepared for burial. Jonah whispered, "Mom?" No response. He stepped closer. The woman slowly turned her head. Not his mother, not even human anymore. Eyes black as obsidian, mouth stitched like the body from below. But the skin, he recognized it. Photographs, portraits. It was Eliza, preserved, feeding. Her body twitched, cracked, unfolded backward as if bones were realigning. Her lips began to move, despite the stitches, whispering through torn flesh. "You broke the seal, child. Now the house wakes again." And with that, the ceiling opened like a jaw. Dozens of bodies fell through, silent, pale, eyes wide open, all wearing Hartwell rings, all his family. Jonah screamed, but the house didn't echo. It swallowed. Jonah stepped through the pink door, and instantly the temperature dropped. Not like a winter chill. This was birth room cold. Sterile, damp, and somehow lonely. The room wasn't large. 4 crumbling walls, a broken crib in the center, and mobiles hanging from the ceiling, twisting in the stale air, made of teeth instead of stars. He barely made it 2 steps before the door slammed behind him. The lights flickered, revealing that the wallpaper was made of tiny handprints, over and over, layered like scales. Some were smudged in red. Jonah's heart raced. This place, it wasn't just a nightmare. It was intentional, like someone had built it to remember something or someone. In the crib lay a small figure wrapped in a tattered blanket, motionless. He approached slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the room itself was pushing back. Then, a sharp cry. The figure jerked, eyes snapped open, pure black, wet and blinking too fast. Jonah froze. He knew that face. It was his. Not as a baby, as a boy, age 6 maybe. Mouth sewn shut, tears leaking from every pore of its pale skin. But the crying wasn't from its mouth. It was coming from the walls, echoing from every direction. Jonah backed away until he felt something behind him. He turned and saw the mirror, tall, oval, covered in dust. He wiped it clean and nearly screamed. His reflection was missing its face, just a blank oval of skin, no eyes, nose, or mouth, but still breathing. And behind him, in the reflection, The child in the crib was now standing, holding something in its stitched shut hands. Jonah turned around. The crib was empty. The air changed. The lullaby returned, this time slower, darker. And then the whispers started. He was born from silence. He will return to silence. From the shadows of the room, dozens of children stepped forward, all faceless, all barefoot, all humming. They circled Jonah, hands outstretched. One of them whispered, "It's your turn in the crib." Jonah backed into the wall, but there was no way out. The crib had reappeared in the center. Only now, it was full-sized and waiting. Jonah awoke on cold stone, but he hadn't fainted. He had transitioned. That's what the Hartwell journals had warned. The house doesn't shift. You do. He was no longer in a room. No longer even in the manor, at least not the version built with timber and glass. This place, this version of Blackwood Hollow was built from bone. The walls pulsed, stitched together with ligaments and marrow. Doors were shaped like rib cages. Stairs groaned like vertebrae when stepped upon. And somewhere, echoing faintly in the walls, the lullaby played again. But this time, it wasn't sweet. It was being hummed through teeth. He pushed forward, trying not to look at the eyes embedded in the wallpaper, hundreds of them, fluttering open and shut like sickly moths. Then came the sound. Scratching. Not nails. Hooves. He turned a corner and there it stood. 8 feet tall, skin stretched so thin you could see the veins pumping. Its head was too small for its body, and it was upside down. A human face, sewn onto the throat of a creature that should not exist. One eye. No mouth. But its chest. It whispered. A tiny, puckered mouth had grown just above its heart, and that's where the lullaby was coming from. Jonah stood frozen, until it turned. Not its body, just its head, twisting fully backward with a loud, wet snap. And then it spoke. Not in a voice, in memories. Jonah's first kiss, his mother's funeral, the sound of his father screaming behind a closed door. The beast wasn't attacking, it was peeling, layer by layer, stripping him of who he was. "Stop!" he cried. "I don't belong here." The creature moved closer, bent low. Its whisper heart gasped. "You were born here, Jonah. You never left." Then it pulled something from its own chest, a key made of bone, slick with rot, and dropped it at his feet. "The nursery awaits." Jonah looked up, shaking. The wall behind the creature faded, revealing a door, painted pink, with his name carved into it. The air smelled like old milk and burnt dolls. Jonah picked up the key. The door opened itself. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. The full-sized crib loomed before him like a coffin carved for the living. Its wood was rotted but still intact. Fresh nails glinted at the edges. The mattress inside was sunken and soaked like something had just crawled out. The faceless children formed a perfect circle around him, silent now, waiting. One stepped forward, smaller than the rest. It held something in its stitched hands. A toy. No, a music box. It opened it with trembling fingers. A mechanical lullaby began to play, high-pitched, broken, like it had been played 1,000,000 times before. Jonah didn't want to look inside, but he had to. He leaned over the crib. There, inside, was a worn-out stuffed rabbit, its eyes missing, its fur scorched, but around its neck was a tag. Jonah read it aloud, barely able to speak. "Belongs to Jonah. Return if found." Suddenly, a voice, not from the children, not from the walls, from inside his own head. "You left us behind. You forgot the room. You forgot yourself. Memories began to surface, flashes, an old house, laughter, a fire, screaming, running, and then silence. Jonah was here before, as a child. This was his nursery, and something terrible happened here. He fell to his knees. The air got heavier, like grief pressing down on every inch of his body. The children began to hum again. Their heads tilted in unison, the lights flickered, the walls trembled, and then, one by one, they peeled their stitched mouths open, not with hands, just force. Threads snapping, blood pooling. They began to speak in his voice, a child's voice, his voice. "Don't leave me again. Stay. Sleep, sleep, sleep." The mobile of teeth spun faster overhead. Jonah tried to stand, but his legs failed him. And then, a hand reached from under the crib, thin, wet, trembling. It gripped his ankle and pulled. He screamed. But the children only hummed louder. The walls bled, the music box slowed, and as he was dragged under, the last thing he saw was his own face, smiling, inside the mirror, trapped, watching, forever.
Jonah gasped awake, but he wasn't in the nursery anymore. No crib, no children, no rotting walls, just darkness. Cold stone beneath his hands, a low ceiling, damp air, and the faint smell of mold and iron. He tried to move, but the space was tight, like a coffin. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Where am I? He reached forward, and his fingers touched something rough. Wooden. A door? No. A hatch. He pushed. It didn't budge. He pushed harder. Still nothing. Then, from above, a scraping sound. Someone or something was moving, pacing. Jonah pressed his ear to the hatch. Creak, creak, creak. Slow, methodical steps. A heavy chain dragged with each movement. It circled the hatch. Jonah's mouth went dry. He remembered stories from the town about the thing that lived below the Black Hollow house. The Keeper. They said it guarded memories, memories no one wanted, pain too heavy for the mind to carry, regrets buried too deep to surface, and if you entered its space, you didn't get to leave, unless it wanted you to. Jonah reached into his pocket, hoping, praying, and found something he didn't recognize. A small key, old, rusted, warm to the touch. Carved into the metal were the initials L.T. Lily Thompson. His breath caught. She wasn't a myth. She was real. And she had been here, in this place. He stared into the black above, the sound of chains growing louder, closer. He had two choices. Wait here and be found, or use the key and open the other hatch, the one below him, barely visible in the stone. A whisper came through the cracks, not from the Keeper, but from a voice Jonah remembered. You have to go deeper, Jonah. That's where I am. It was Lily. Faint, afraid, but real. Jonah didn't hesitate. He turned the key in the lower hatch. It clicked, and with a deep breath, he pulled it open. The air that rose up wasn't air at all. It was like memory itself. Burnt, sorrowful, alive. Jonah descended, into the dark, into her world, and the hatch closed behind him, on its own. Jonah's feet landed on something soft, not stone, not wood, but soil, damp, warm, freshly disturbed. The air was heavy like fog laced with sorrow. It didn't smell like a basement, it smelled like a grave. He could barely see, but shapes flickered at the edges of his vision, shadows that moved when he didn't, and in the distance, barely audible, a sound like children weeping. Not loud, not desperate, just continuous, as if the sadness had gone on for years. He called out, "Lily?
Are you here?"
No reply, but the weeping stopped. That silence was worse. Then came a whisper from behind him. "Don't look at them. Just walk." He turned. No one. But he obeyed. Each step sank slightly, the soil pulling at his boots like it wanted to keep him. He passed crooked headstones, names worn away, toy blocks half buried, a stuffed rabbit moldy and eyeless, and scratched into a broken plank nailed to a tree. These are the forgotten. Jonah shivered. This wasn't just a basement, it was a burial ground of memories, memories that didn't want to be unearthed. Then, ahead, a faint glow. He moved faster, through the graves, past the rusted swing set that creaked though no wind blew. The light came from a mirror, tall, framed in bone-white wood, and standing alone in a clearing of dead trees. He approached, but his reflection wasn't his own. It was a girl, pale, eyes wide, hair matted with blood and soil. She stared straight at him, not at the mirror, at him. Her lips moved, but her voice echoed inside his mind. "You've come too far, Jonah. You can't wake up until you see it." "See what?" he whispered aloud. She raised a hand and pointed. The mirror fogged, and a new image appeared. A small house, a nursery, a fire, and Jonah standing there, watching it burn, not trying to save anyone, not screaming, just smiling. His knees buckled. "No, that's not true. I tried to help. I heard the scream." The girl's expression didn't change. "You didn't hear her scream. You heard her call your name, but you waited." "Why?" The whisper tore through him like ice. "Because you wanted to see what would happen." The mirror shattered, and everything went black except for the sound of Lily crying. The next morning they found something waiting on the town's welcome sign. It wasn't a warning, it was a memory. Nailed into the wood, right under the words "Welcome to Millbrook," was a child's shoe. Muddy, old, burnt on one side, and inside it a tiny handwritten note, soaked in what everyone prayed was red ink. "I remember where you buried me." The sheriff, Howard Dells, took one look at it and turned pale. He didn't touch the shoe, didn't take the note. He simply ordered the sign removed and told every officer on duty to say nothing. But word spread anyway. Millbrook always kept secrets. But it was even better at spreading rumors. Some said it was a prank. Others said it was a message from the one survivor who'd escaped the funeral home all those years ago. But the old folks, the ones who remembered the Hartwell sons, they knew the truth. Jonah had begun his ritual, and the town had 3 days left. That night, candles were seen burning inside the Hartwell house, but no one lit them. No one had gone in or out. One of the neighbors swore she saw someone at the top window staring into the street, holding something in their mouth that was dripping. A jawbone. But when police were called, the candles were gone. Jonah himself was last seen walking into the woods behind the graveyard, but not alone. 3 children followed him. No one knew who they were. No one ever saw them arrive. No parents reported them missing. They just followed him, silent, barefoot. One was holding a crow's wing. Another carried a dead fox by the tail. The third had her mouth sewn shut. And all of them smiled. Someone tried to approach, but when they did, they vanished. Not in the ran away kind of way. They were standing one moment and gone the next. The search dogs refused to go into the woods. The next morning, a different child's shoe was left on every doorstep in town, all burnt, all facing the same direction, toward the funeral home, toward Jonah, and toward the reckoning that had already begun. By the time the town clock struck midnight, the whispers had returned, carried on the wind like lullabies sung by the dead. But this time, everyone heard them. Every home, every room, every ear. Whispers that weren't in any known language, yet every word felt familiar, like something you'd been forced to forget. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers locked every door, every window, and prayed to gods they'd long abandoned. In the attic of the old Thompson house, a boy named Eli scribbled symbols onto the floorboards. He didn't know what they meant. His hands moved on their own. He was crying, but his face never changed, completely still, as though it belonged to someone else. He carved a circle around himself, then placed 7 small animal bones at each corner. When his mother found him, she screamed, because his eyes were missing. And yet, he could still see her. In another part of Millbrook, Mrs. Hargrove, who hadn't spoken since her son died in 1983, began chanting names in her sleep. Names no one in town recognized, except one. Jonah Hartwell. She kept repeating it until her tongue split. That night, the Hartwell Funeral Home's bell, long rusted shut, rang by itself, once for each life Jonah had claimed as a child. 12 times. Each toll shook the town. Each one brought something back. In the graveyard, dirt shifted. Hands twitched beneath the soil. Headstones began to bleed, not symbolically, but with actual thick black-red ooze that stank of rot and centuries-old decay. Sheriff Dells finally broke down and confessed. Back in 1985, Jonah was never buried. They locked him inside the cremation chamber, but the fire refused to burn. They tried 3 times. The 3rd time, the flames turned blue and cold. No babies had pressed play. In fact, half of them weren't even alive when that lullaby existed. But somehow, they all cried at the same time. And outside every nursery window, a shadow stood, tall, still, smiling, holding a toy that belonged to a child who'd been missing for over 40 years. The next morning, the town of Millbrook woke up to silence, but not the peaceful kind. No birds chirped, no engines roared, no one dared to speak. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. When Mayor Whitmore tried to call the state police, all lines were dead. Even the radios gave nothing but static, except for one frequency, 66.6 FM. A voice spoke from it, childlike, sweet. "Let's play again." The voice was followed by laughter, dozens of children laughing in unison. But every parent in Millbrook knew those weren't the voices of the living. One by one, the children in town started to act strangely. They stopped blinking, stopped eating, stared at corners and darkened windows as if something was standing just out of sight. At noon, a little girl named Sophie Hartwell, Jonah's niece, walked barefoot into the center of town. Her white dress was soaked in mud and something darker. Her eyes rolled back, and with a trembling voice not her own, she whispered, "He never left. He was always here. In the floorboards, in the dust, in the lullabies, in me." She collapsed. From her pocket a tooth fell out. Not hers. An adult molar, yellowed and cracked. It had a bite mark in it. Meanwhile, the school bell rang on its own. The building had been abandoned since 1991, and yet lights flickered inside. The blackboard wrote on itself, "Class is in session. Attendance, 12 missing souls." When police broke in, they found the walls covered in old report cards, all with the name Jonah Hartwell written across the top. Grades were all perfect, behavior, eternal detention. And then they heard it. From the janitor's closet, scratching. When they opened the door, there was no one inside, just a worn-out teddy bear. It blinked and whispered, "He's teaching us to come back." Every mirror in town shattered at once. On every shard, written in blood-red scratches, was the same message. "You watched him suffer.
Now watch him smile." From that day on, every time someone in Millbrook blinked, Jonah got a little closer. That night, the townspeople gathered at the church, the oldest building in Millbrook and the only place that hadn't been touched by the madness. Yet. Fathers clutched rosaries with shaking hands. Mothers wept silently, shielding their children's eyes from the flickering candles that now seemed to cast too many shadows. Father Elias, a man of quiet faith and fewer words, stepped to the pulpit and spoke with a tremble in his voice. "This is no haunting. This is a reckoning." He explained what few dared to accept, that the town had buried not just a child, but a curse. Back in 1987, Jonah Hartwell was found locked in the basement of the very school where he studied, starved, tortured, forgotten. It wasn't a ghost that haunted Millbrook. It was a wound, festering and feeding off silence, and now it was wide open. Suddenly, the church organ bellowed on its own, every candle extinguished at once. The doors slammed shut, and from the bell tower above, a lullaby began to play. Faint at first, then louder, not sung by a choir, but by one voice, raspy, broken, and filled with venomous glee. "Rock-a-bye, baby, in the old tree. When the town sleeps, you'll swing with me." Screams echoed as people tried to flee, but the pews began to bleed, thick black sludge oozing from the wood. One man, Officer Beck, fired his gun at the pulpit, shouting, "Show yourself!" But when the smoke cleared, his own son stood where the bullet landed, smiling, with hollowed-out eyes. "Dad, wanna see what Jonah showed me?" He opened his mouth, too wide, and out crawled a centipede, its legs carved with names of townspeople, all still alive. Then the floor split open beneath them, just for a moment, enough to see what lay below. Rows of desks, rotting apples, hundreds of dolls nailed to chalkboards, and a single desk in the center, pristine, a name tag on it, Mr. Hartwell. The basement of the church had become a classroom of the damned, and from somewhere down there a bell rang. Once, twice, then silence. The townspeople knew. They hadn't come to pray. They had come to attend their first lesson in hell. Millbrook turned into a ghost town overnight. Shops stood empty, lights still on, radio still playing static, dogs barked at shadows, and the wind seemed to whisper children's laughter where no children remained. Only a few stayed behind, either too brave or too broken to leave. Among them, Father Elias, Officer Beck, and Clara Monroe, the town librarian, who everyone had always called odd, but now they looked to her for answers. Clara had spent decades collecting records, diaries, even forbidden folklore about Millbrook. She knew every founding family's secrets, especially the Hartwells. In the silence of her candlelit home, she opened a dusty, leather-bound journal labeled,
"Property of Jonah Hartwell. Do not read." But she read it anyway. "They made me sit in the dark for days. They told me the light would only come if I was good. But the light never came. So I made my own." Clara's hands trembled as she turned the pages, drawings of black suns, chalkboard spells written in Latin, crude illustrations of rituals, binding spirits to objects, to places, even to names, and at the very end of the journal, a page torn out. But on the inside cover was scratched a final note. "Don't let them erase me if they forget me. I become God." Clara's eyes widened. This wasn't a ghost. Jonah had made himself into a story that feeds on memory. The more people remembered him, feared him, spoke his name, the more real he became. It wasn't revenge, it was resurrection. Meanwhile, Father Elias returned to the old school building alone. Armed with only holy water, pages from the Book of Enoch, and his trembling faith, he descended into the basement. But this time it was no longer a basement. It had transformed, a cathedral of chalk and bone, school desks lined like pews, and at the altar stood a figure in a teacher's coat, no face, just a smile drawn in black charcoal. Father Elias whispered a prayer, but the figure raised a ruler, blood-stained and cracked. "You're late, to class." The walls began to shake. Screams echoed, not from people, but from memories. Every time someone in town thought of Jonah, the figure grew stronger, louder. And in that moment, Father Elias finally understood. The only way to destroy Jonah was to forget him. But how do you erase a name etched in trauma? And how do you silence a ghost that doesn't haunt you, but teaches you?
The next morning, Clara called a secret meeting. Inside the church basement, ironically the only place untouched by Jonah's presence, the last remaining townspeople gathered. Clara, Father Elias, Officer Beck, old Mrs. Linney, and 3 teenagers who had nowhere else to go. The plan was desperate. Forget him. Erase every trace. Destroy photos, books, journals, even memories. But how do you forget someone whose evil is written into the town's soul? Clara stood before them, holding Jonah's journal. "I know it sounds impossible," she said, her voice shaking. "But this isn't just about ghosts. This is about belief. Jonah Hartwell only exists because we remember. He's become an echo that feeds on fear, repetition, and grief." Father Elias nodded grimly. "It's biblical, like a reverse Messiah. The more you say his name, the more power you give him." Officer Beck leaned in. "So what do we do? Hypnosis? Amnesia pills?" Clara shook her head. "We break the cycle. We burn the stories, and we stop speaking his name." A tense silence filled the room. Then came the real question. Mrs. Linney whispered, "But what if he comes for us?" Clara looked at her and replied, "He already has, but we gave him the door." That night, Millbrook changed forever. They started with the library. Row by row, they fed the fireplace everything linked to the Hartwell name. Birth certificates, letters, photos, even yearbooks. The townsfolk gathered around the flames like worshippers at an exorcism. Next, they erased the school chalkboard where he first appeared, scrubbing until their fingers bled. But the hardest part was letting go of memories. People clung to them, trauma disguised as truth. But they had to forget him, to save themselves. Each time someone slipped up and said the name, shadows crept at the edges. Lights flickered. Whispers echoed in reverse. But when they stayed silent, the town grew calmer, lighter. Children who had vanished returned in their dreams, safe, smiling, and untouched by the shadow of his memory. One by one, the darkness shrank, until only one name remained, carved into stone. At the cemetery, Clara stood before the grave, heart pounding. "Last one," she whispered. She struck the stone with a sledgehammer, again and again, until the name turned to dust. As the wind howled through the valley, a voice whispered one last time, "You needed me to remember you were afraid." And then, silence. Jonah Hartwell was no more, because no one remembered who he was.